Good morning and welcome to Positively Politics, the show where we break down the sometimes complicated and often negative world of politics in a straightforward and academically rooted way. My name is Dr. Laura Merrifield Wilson. I'm a professor of political science at the University of Indianapolis, as well as the host of this show. And whether you're catching this live on WICR 88.7 The Diamond, or if you're tuning in wherever you get your podcast, I want to thank you for joining me here today. Now, if you've listened to Positively Politics before, you know what I'm about to say, but this show is all about asking questions, inciting conversations, bringing in data points, state comparisons, we're going to be heavy on that today, historical context to give us a greater sense of what's going on in the world. And what I want to focus on in this episode are recounts in elections. Now, you might be thinking, I'm getting ahead of myself here, right? The general election isn't until November. And yes, I know, although I am one of those people who, as soon as we're done with one election, you look forward to the other. I feel like that with holidays too. Actually, with most things, I just think it requires preparation. And hey, it's exciting. What can I say? But you're right. While the general election is not till November, I'm not anticipating a recount there. I'm talking about what happens, especially right now, we're in primary season, to trigger an automatic recount in states where they have that? Or what happens when an election is so close in terms of results that a candidate wants to challenge the election results? The states are different in this, and I thought it'd be a good use of time and really fascinating for me to understand those differences, how states approach recounts, who's allowed to have a recount. I mentioned triggering those automatic recounts. Well, some states have them, some states don't. And this topic is inspired because Indiana and Ohio had their primary elections this week. And in Indiana, you had not one, but two state Senate elections that were so close. Though the most recent numbers I can tell you is there is a 4-vote difference in incumbent Spencer Deary's race in West Lafayette. Shows him ahead by just 4 votes against challenger Paula Copenhaver. And there is a 15-vote difference between incumbent Liz Brown from Fort Wayne and her challenger Darren Voigt. And that is very, very close. So that's why I was inspired. I was like, we gotta talk about this. I do want to talk about Indiana's elections, and I want to talk about these recounts as a whole. So that's what we're going to focus on today. That thin margin of error. What do we do with it? And I just want to add and emphasize, I think this is important to remember. A lot of times people say, I don't feel like my vote matters. I don't feel like my vote counts. Well, of course it does. And even when it's overwhelming, quite frankly, it's still sharing your opinion, whether you're of the majority or the minority. But when we're talking about 15 votes, 4 votes in a state Senate race, and these are, like low thresholds. So in this case, we're talking about races where you had 10,000 to 12,000 voters. So yeah, small pool here. There's state Senate races, and it's a primary. Not everyone shows up, but still, right? 15 votes, 4 votes that literally decide the outcome of your representation. I'm Dr. Laura Merrifield Wilson here for Positively Politics on WICR 88.7 The Diamond, and wherever you get your podcast. So let's jump in first just with the primaries to give us a background. Ohio and Indiana had their primaries this week. And as I mentioned, we are in election season, primary election season. So we've already seen other states like Texas and North Carolina with their primaries. And throughout the spring and into midsummer, we will continue to see the primary election results. Now, primaries are helpful for us because that's where the political parties select the candidates that will represent them in November. And I'm thinking in the future, I want to do a show about parties versus conventions. In Indiana, our conventions are in June. So I think closer to that time would make a lot of sense. But understand that parties are used to allow voters to select who represents their party in a convention style system, which is what we used to rely on. And some states still have. Indiana does use this for our Secretary of State's race, for example, and Lieutenant Governor's race. In a convention, only delegates who are elected to represent the party get to select the candidates, right? So a primary is a very lowercase d democratic opportunity for voters who affiliate with the party to decide who they want to be their party's nominee, their party's representative. It goes on in the general election in November. Of course, the general election is where we ultimately select the candidate. So that's why the primary elections are really important. And typically we see lower voter turnout in primary elections because we have what we call a bimodal distribution of voters, meaning bi is 2. Modal refers to the mode, right? And this is average, right? Where we would place people. And you have 2 averages of where people really peak in a primary election because you will not have many independents, moderates, people in the middle, right? A unimodal distribution of voters is what we see in the general election, where we have a lot of people on a 7-point Likert scale in that very middle 4 position. It is your bell curve. Picture the bell. That's a general election because you've got lots of independents, moderates, people in between. And independence doesn't necessarily mean they're moderate. I recognize that, right? But it's going to look like a bell curve where there's a lot of people in that 4 center spot. Not so much in a primary election. Why aren't there moderates? Why aren't there independents in a primary election typically? Well, because the primary election is for the parties to select their candidates. It's not to say that you couldn't, say, oh, I'm an independent, but I'm going to vote in this party's primary. Depending on the primary you have in your state, you might be able to do that. But typically, the parties are going to pull people who are more, just by definition, hardcore partisan, who identify with a political party and want to select the candidates that represent them. So that is that bimodal distribution, where it kind of looks like 2 humps of a camel, or the way that I draw a cursive M. I never actually learned cursive in school, so I just was self-taught. Right? It goes up, down, up, down. No one in the center because those moderates don't participate in party primaries. But you do see people, right, on either extreme, left or right. So that's what we look at in terms of the primaries. Now let's talk about these close races that we saw in Indiana. Indiana had really interesting state Senate races where you had challengers that were heavily favored and supported by President Trump, who gave money. Senator Jim Banks from Indiana also contributed from his PAC. We saw a lot of outside organization groups, Turning Point USA, Club for Growth, play a really large role in our state Senate races. And this was in part because of the redistrict conversation that was decided in Indiana back in December, where the state Senate, specifically a handful of Republicans, opposed and voted as such against redistricting. Thus, our state did not redraw party lines. Now, there are states that did. Texas, Virginia has started that process. You saw it in California, but not in Indiana. And so President Trump supported these challengers. And then the challengers, for the most part, were widely successful on Tuesday. 6 incumbents fell to President Trump-supported challengers, which tells you a lot, I think, about the primary elections and those primary voters. Now, if you're just tuning in, you're listening here to Positively Politics. I'm Dr. Laura Merrifield Wilson. This show, of course, is on WICR 88.7 The Diamond and wherever you listen to podcasts. Now, I don't want to ignore Ohio. They just didn't have the same level of competition in their primary election. And when we look across the board at primary elections, competition is what drives voter turnout. In Indiana, there's a lot to be said for high voter turnout this cycle. And the numbers, of course, are being tallied still, but it looked like we had great voter turnout because I'm going to say in large part, there was competition for voters. Whether you were a Democrat or Republican, there were actual races with options that you got to decide. So let's go into now talking about how close some of those races were. I mentioned 15 points in one of the state Senate races here in Indiana. That was Liz Brown, Fort Wayne state senator, with a challenge, Darren Voigt, and then also Spencer Deary, another state senator up from West Lafayette, his challenger, Paula Koppenweger, with a 4-vote difference. So what do states do? Almost all states, 48 states, allow for election recounts. And what I find fascinating, so 2 southern states, Mississippi and Tennessee, don't. They do not have a recount system or mechanism. So as we say in my family, and sometimes I say in my classes too, you get what you get and you don't throw a fit. So how it is counted is how it's counted. right? But it's important to know 48 other states have some kind of mechanism for a recount. And typically we would see that as being an important feature of a democracy because you want to make sure that the count is accurate. I think every candidate would want this, and just broadly, voters should want this too. Right? And of course, you want to have a positive outcome. You want your candidate to win. Yeah, sure, same. But you want to make sure that it's accurate. And of course, I've been adding another of course here, right? But it's the candidates that are losing, the candidates that are coming up shy in votes, right? Those are the ones that are typically going to be pushing for the recount, whereas those, even by a slim majority that we're winning, are going to say the current number is just fine. So almost all states, save Mississippi and Tennessee, have a recount system. Now, most states, right, have what we call a requested recount. So that is one that you have to ask for, either as the candidate or the party, but a requested recount is one that is prompted, right? Now, there are also some states, and this is a possibility, so you recognize some states have both a requested recount. Some states utilize automatic recounts. And in an automatic recount, if the vote is close enough, and I mean close, like when we say political science close, it's like a close race is like 2%. In some cases, these are a 0.1% margin. Tight, very close. If your race is close, depending on the state law, there are 28 states that have automatic recounts. So 43 with requested recounts, 28 with automatic recounts. If you wonder, by the way, where I'm getting this information, the National Conference of State Legislatures, that's the NCSL, is absolutely fantastic. And you know, if you listen to the show, I love my state comparisons. So there are some states, of course, that have both automatic and requested counts. Now, what I find interesting here is like looking at the differences. And as I was studying this, who gets to request a recount, right? Who covers the cost of a recount? How does the recount work? And interestingly, to me, for starters, in some states, you have restrictions in terms of who's allowed to request the recount. So we're talking here about Indiana primaries, where you have two election results, two state Senate races specifically, in which the incumbent has a very narrow lead, 15 votes, 4 votes, right? Two different races here. So for Indiana, in Indiana State Code, the two people who have the ability to request a recount is the candidate themselves. Again, strategy game theory tells you the candidate that's winning is not going to request a recount. They like the results. But the candidate that is shy 4 votes, the candidate that's shy 15 votes, absolutely would like you to recount those and make sure they're correct. So the candidate themselves can request it, or the chairperson of a state or county political party. Now, the way the parties work varies within states too, but typically the chairs with political parties, I would say in Indiana, have a pretty strong grasp, both on their candidates. They have a lot of strength broadly. They have a lot of responsibility, and they have a lot of power. So giving both the county chairperson and the state chairperson this ability, this authority to request a recount, I think adds to the strategy of whether or not you want to go through with it and what it looks like. Now, you might be saying, why wouldn't you go through with it? Why wouldn't you get a recount? Why wouldn't you confirm? I am so glad you asked. Well, I told you about the automatic versus the requested recounts, right? But one thing that's probably important to also know is who has to pay for them, right? Because a recount is expensive. And in almost a majority of states, in 23 states, the person who requests it has to cover the cost. So that's why. If you're losing by 4 votes and you aren't sure if that's accurate, right? I mean, when in doubt, yeah, I would always want one, but they're going to have to pay for the cost. Now, I think a natural follow-up question, one that I had and I was trying to research, would be how much, right? What are we talking about? $5-10? 5,000, 10,000? 50,000, 100,000? Okay, because my decision is going to be different based on your answer to that number. And I could not find a good verifiable fact. What would be a good estimate? I couldn't find one. I will tell you, I do think it's more than the $5 to $10 range. But could it fare more than 10,000? 100,000? I would be guessing it's less than 100,000, but that would be an important part of the calculus. And again, this would be something that candidates would likely speak with their party chairs. It's tricky in a primary election because understand both of the candidates in both of these Indiana state Senate races that I'm describing, right, would be covering the same amount of territory, would theoretically have the same county party chairs, and they absolutely have the same state party chair. So from that person's perspective, right, is it worth the money to do a recount? That's part of the calculus here. And interestingly enough, I told you in 23 states, the person who requests the recount has to pay for it. There are 7 states where the state covers the cost. That's not in Indiana, so that would be a part of the calculus and the decision there. And then 11 states have a special system where it depends on the circumstances of the election, right, and what the recount is. So it would depend, at least in part, on what type of election, what race, if there's a reason for the recount. And I do think this is important to add at this point. We've seen historical recounts. If you think back to Florida, Bush v. Gore, 2020, that presidential election, where we had reason to believe some of the ballots may have been miscounted. I want to be crystal clear here. I do not live in the communities of Fort Wayne or up near West Lafayette, but I have not heard of any reason we would suspect the counts were inaccurate. This question of a recount from a candidate's perspective is purely because it's so close. If 1 or 2 ballots were counted incorrectly, in the case of Spencer Deary and Paula Copenhager, if 4 ballots are counted incorrectly, that is a change of an outcome. Actually, if 2 were, Deary is ahead in this race by 4 ballots. What if 2 of those counted for Deary actually were miscounted? Now it's a tie, an actual tie, right? So that is why you'd have this conversation. I want to remind you that you're listening here either wherever you get your podcast or to WICR 88.7 The Diamond. Beautiful, beautiful day. I'm Dr. Laura Merrifield Wilson for Positively Politics. We're talking about the recounts. When, why, how, and my favorite question as someone who is perennial cheap. Right? How much? How much are these recounts? Of course, that's the harder question to answer. I'm talking about the recounts today because we saw very close races in our primary election cycle. And I want to go back to the question of margins because typically when we talk about election results, that is my go-to piece of analysis. Any given election, right? What are things that I look at? I have people ask me this all the time. So what are you looking for? And there's specific dynamics. There are specific races, specific candidates, specific messages, themes, right? Issues to every election cycle. And those are, if you can catch the common term here, specific, right? They're going to be particular. But in broad terms, what are things we always look at in political science, right? One of them is going to be turnout, right? High turnout, excited, enthusiastic, enraged voters, high quality, good range, multiple options of candidates, issues that really resonated and connected with folks, right? Turnout will be something that's important here. The other thing I always look at is margin. It's margin. And margin matters in a way that I think takes a little bit of extra thought because in American politics, we have a winner-take-all system. And in states where you do not have runoff elections, such as Indiana, Ohio, right? You don't have to have a majority of the vote. You can have several candidates. Talk about crowded primaries. I'm going to highlight one. There's an Indiana state Senate race where you had over a handful of them. I mean, it was actually Indiana's 5th congressional district. I think you had 8 candidates running for the Democratic primary. So, right, very crowded primary. It's highly unlikely the more candidates you have that any one candidate will get to a majority or 51%. But you can have a candidate with a plurality. Now, in states that have runoff elections, they require a majority, so they're going to give their top 2 into a runoff. We talked about those Texas primaries a couple months ago, right? You see that for the Republican primary in the Senate race in Texas, where you had 2 candidates. That was Ken Paxton was among them, right? John Cornyn was the other, and then a handful of other candidates. Well, Paxton and Cornyn got the most votes, but neither had a statistical majority, so they have a runoff election, right? But in states where you have no runoff elections, it is simply based on the majority of candidates. It could be the plurality if you have enough candidates that are going to split the vote. And I think that that's important to see. So when we're talking about margin, the reason, again, margin matters is even though it is a winner-take-all system, so the candidate with the majority or plurality of votes, the candidate with the most votes wins. Margin matters because it indicates to us how voters were thinking and feeling. And sure, if you lose, it doesn't matter if you lose by, let's say, 4 or 15 votes to go back to those particular states and races, or if you lose by thousands, you get nothing. You win nothing. I feel like Willy Wonka at the end of the new Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, right? There's nothing there. But if it is close, that signifies, right, voters made a very difficult decision. That signifies issues resonated, candidates resonated. For the candidate that loses, I think that gives you confidence, even though you don't win the election. There are a lot of people that liked you. What was the difference maker, right? Does it deal with incumbency, challenger, open seat status? Was money a factor? Was it name recognition, right? Was it partisanship? Was it the composition of the district? Was it voter turnout, to go back to that, right? That should give you confidence. A close race, even losing a close race, does matter. And that's something that a political analyst like myself will remember and will say, oh, you know what? Yes, this candidate ran before, they lost, but that was a really close race. Now, for the parties, this matters too. For a party primary, it plays a little differently because these are all candidates that are running on the same party ticket. So it's not to say that, like, wow, the parties are really competitive. There's just Democrats running against Democrats, just Republicans running against Republicans. But if there's a fissure within the party, in this case, when we're talking about the Indiana state Senate races, this primary was a referendum on the president's popularity, which lo and behold is still very strong amongst Republican primary voters in Indiana. I think Tuesday's results prove that. And also more broadly on the redistricting issue itself. That's a little bit more complicated, but when we're looking in terms of these election results, that is where you see a difference between the primary candidates, right? So you can't ignore that certainly plays some factor, that certainly plays some role in this calculus of voting decision. Now, you're listening here to WICR 88.7 The Diamond, or wherever you get your podcasts. This is Positively Politics. I'm Dr. Laura Merrifield Wilson, talking today about recounts, right? Count it once, count it twice, sometimes perhaps a third time. But why we have recounts, when recounts are triggered, whether it's automatic or requested, who has to pay, right? And why one would consider doing a recount and also potentially consider not. That's the next question we're going to tackle here. As we look at these election results, and I mentioned margin matters, that is the whole point of a recount, right? Having a close margin. When I already tell you that many states will require a requested recount, so it's not necessarily automatic. If you want to recount, you're going to have to request it as the candidate or as the political party chair. Right? And then you may also have to pay if you're requesting the recount. There are some exceptions, by the way, which are fascinating. And I know I'm talking about a lot of, say, this number of states, that number of states. States vary widely in their recount policies. But there are some exceptions where the person who pays, it depends on whether or not the recount shows a different result, which to me is fascinating. So basically, if you suspect the result is wrong, you're willing to hedge your bets and you call for a recount. And if you are correct, then voila, you don't have to pay for it. I think it's fascinating. It's actually a very similar principle that's applied in tort reform, where they institute a loser pays theory. So the idea, of course, is that you have to take some level of risk. Do you really feel like you were wronged so much and you need the justice system to correct it that you feel confident a judge or jury will side in your favor, right? If so, you don't mind loser pays because you are pretty sure you're going to win. But that is, of course, a risk you're taking, because if you lose, then you aren't paying, right? A similar concept here. But I want to talk about the margins. I always like looking at margins in elections, whether they're close or far away. Real quick, our typical standard, and this is not like agreed upon, political science do not vote on this. There is not a law and statute that we, sign a blood oath to. But what I tell you, typically we say like a landslide is going to be a 20% margin of difference. So one candidate wins by 60%. The next candidate has 40%, right? 20% difference, landslide. When we say it's a safe race, 10% between the two. So 55, 45. If we're talking about close, right, I think it's about 5%. And sometimes 5% doesn't even really feel that close. I'd say in Indiana politics, right, quite frankly, in Ohio politics right now, in states that feel very one-sided, right? California, New York for Democrats, probably Texas, probably Florida now for Republicans. In those states that are really one-sided, 5% is close. In a swing state, 5% may not feel that close either. Right? Let's go to how we apply margins, though, to these requested recall elections. And I want to remind you that you're listening here to Positively Politics. I'm Dr. Laura Merrifield Wilson for WICR 88.7 The Diamond and wherever you get your podcasts listening to us here today. I was talking about recall elections, and I mentioned that some of these have very small margins of victory. Now, for some of the states where you are going to request it as a candidate or the party chair and you are going to pay for it, like in Indiana, there is no margin required. You could lose by thousands. And if that's how you want to spend your money and time, go for it. Recall away. I think for a lot of reasons, most people wouldn't want to. We've already established I'm cheap. I wouldn't want to do it. Right? Now, there are states, though, that would have smaller percentages. So I'm going to highlight one that I think is really interesting here, and this is Delaware. So again, you can find this information. Ballotopedia actually has this information. National Conference of State Legislatures has this information. If you're like me and interested in seeing how all 50 states do this. In Delaware, right, their threshold, their margin is 0.5% for statewide offices or 1,000 votes, whichever is less. Right? So you're talking about a real slim margin. Now, when we're talking about statewide offices, that 0.5% likely applies to gubernatorial elections because less than 1,000 votes in a gubernatorial election would be incredibly close, right? But for some of the statewide offices where you don't capture as many voters, and some states do, in Indiana, they stagger. So we elect our governor, lieutenant governor, and then we'll have one other executive office, and then we'll flip and we'll do our Secretary of State and Auditor Treasurer. Like say you split them half and half, right? Depending on which election cycle it is. Obviously, more people vote for governor than they do for Secretary of State when those run in opposite election cycles. Now, there were other states that had even smaller percent. Interesting to me, looking at Iowa, for a federal or a statewide race, it is 0.15% in order to have a recount. 0.15%. That's the margin that one candidate has to be below, right? The difference between the two candidates, I guess, has to be in order to have a recount. For state legislative and local races, they specify the lesser of, again, 1% or 50 votes. So if these state races that I've been talking about, these state Senate races in Indiana were actually in Iowa, both of those are within the threshold that they would have a recount. Now, there are a number of states that don't have a margin. There are some that I consider to be almost kind of high, quite frankly. If you have a 2-candidate race in Maryland, less than 5%, boom, you can do a recount. But these margins matter because it is a part of our ethos, our understanding of like how close is close enough. At what point do you say you just accept it? You just hope they were all counted correctly. Is it 50 votes? Is it 5%? Is it 15 votes? Is it 4 votes as we see in Spencer Deary and Paula Copenhager's race? Right? We can talk about a very slim majority. Now, I want to emphasize here as we're winding down the conversation, how important accuracy recounts are in terms of democracy, right? Because if our democracy is truly democratic, it has to be accurate. It has to be fair. It has to be transparent and accountable. And if we miscount ballots, and human error is human, to error is human. Right? These things are just, they're intertwined indefinitely. But you need to have a system or a process. I'm looking at you, Mississippi and Tennessee, where you have no recall process. There's no recounts there, right? You have to have some sort of system to make sure that things are accurate. And whether you have a recount and you say, yes, it is, everything was right, we just confirmed it, we wanted to make sure, or you have a recount and you find that the outcome is different, right? To give voters confidence, to give candidates confidence, to understand and to hold up the veracity of the system, right? Having that recount to ensure accuracy is absolutely necessary. And I will say it is a paramount feature of a democracy. It is a requirement to have, especially when you have these close races. And I want to thank you for tuning in here, whether you're catching this where you get your podcast or on WICR 88.7 The Diamond. I come out with a new episode every week. For Positively Politics, I'm Dr. Laura Merrifield Wilson.